right, now that we know that 1/3 is equal to 2/6, in this lesson, the title of it is Simplest Form. Yes, it's true that the girls each took 2/6 of the tart, but that fraction 2/6 is not written in what's called simplest form. 2/6 in simplest form would actually be 1/3. So now we're going to see a little bit more about simplest form and how to write fractions in their simplest form. A fraction is in simplest form when you can represent it using as few equal parts of a whole as possible. You need to describe the part you have in equal size parts. If you can't describe the part you have using fewer parts, then you cannot simplify the fraction. Okay, so for example, in that first problem, 2/6, that was not represented in as few of equal parts as it could be. We could have simplified it down into 1/3. So if you are asked to simplify fractions, there are a couple ways that you can do it. One way you can do it is you can use models to write an equivalent fraction in simplest form. So let's look at a couple of those. Here are these circles. We have a model, and if you notice, the same amount is shaded in on both of those models that we're comparing. Here, it's divided into 8 equal parts, and 2 of them are shaded, so that fraction would be 2/8. In the second example, if you look at the solid lines here, where it's connecting those together, this is showing 1, 2, 3, 4 equal parts, and 1 of the equal parts is shaded in. So this would be written as a fraction of 1/4. And looking here at the model, would you say that 2/8 and 1/4 are equal to each other? They are. 2/8 equals 1/4. And if you look right here, we have our 2/8. And if we would take that 2 and divide it by 2, you would get 1. And whatever you do to the numerator, you do the same thing to the denominator. So 8 divided by 2 equals 4. So taking the fraction 2/8 and writing it in simplest form would be 1/4. Let's look at another example. Look at these 2 rectangles. In this first one, it's divided into 10 equal parts, and there are 6 of them shaded in. So that fraction would be 6/10. The second model, we have the same rectangle, but if you look here, these lines are solid. So instead of 10 equal parts, this one is divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 equal parts. So they've gotten us started over here. We know our denominator is going to be 5 because that's how many equal parts there are. But we need to figure out then what the numerator is. So out of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 equal parts, there are 1, 2, 3 of them shaded. So the fraction to represent that one would actually be 3/5. So now if we look over here, if we are taking the fraction 6/10 and we were asked to write it in simplest form, well, we already know it's going to be 3/5. And let's use that idea that we have to do the same thing to both the numerator and the denominator in order it to be an equivalent fraction, but written down in its simplest form. So to go from 6 to 3, you would need to take the 6 and divide it by 2. Which means I have to take that 10 and divide it by 2. Is 10 divided by 2 5? Yes, it is. So 6/10 written in simplest form would be 3/5. Okay, now just like what I always say in class, when we're doing these problems like this is really nice that we have these diagrams to look at, and you have objects divided into their equal parts and shaded in and shown a different way. But when we're asked to take a fraction and write it in simplest form, we're not always going to have these nice little models to work with. So we need to know another way that we can do this. Let's look down here at another way. They want us to use the fraction 6/10, right there, 6/10, and write it in simplest form. But to get there, we're not going to draw a picture. We're not going to draw a diagram. We're going to use common factors. Remember those? We have to know the factors of our numbers to be able to simplify fractions a little bit easier. So if you look here, a fraction is in simplest form when 1 is the only factor that the numerator and the denominator have in common. The parts of the whole cannot be combined into fewer equal-sized parts to show that same fraction. If they don't have any other factors other than 1, then it would already be in simplest form. So here's how we would do that. We have to take our numerator from the fraction, so in 6/10 it's 6. Our denominator is 10, and we're going to list out the factors for both of those numbers. So, factors of 6. Well, every number has the factor of 1, right? And 1 times what will give us 6? 1 times 6 will give us 6. We have 2 other factors that we need to fill in here. I notice about the number 6, it is an even number, so that means one of its factors has to be 2. And then 2 times what would give us 6? 2 times 3. So there's our factors of 6, 1, 2, 3, and 6. Now we need to list the factors of 10 in the same way. 1 is always a factor of every number. 1 times itself, 1 times 10 would give us 10, right? And let's see, 10, is it an even number? It is, so it has to have a factor of 2, and 2 times what would give us 10? 2 times 5. So there's 10's factors as well. Now, there's a second part here. We had to list the factors, and then it says circle common factors, meaning the ones that they have the same. So let's see. They both have 1 as a common factor, and 6 and 10 both have 2 as a common factor. Do both of them have 3, or 6, or 5, or 10? Those aren't common. So what we're looking for is the greatest common factor that these 2 numbers have. So in this case, the greater of those numbers out of 1 and 2 would be 2. Now for step 2, we're going to divide the numerator and the denominator by a common factor that's greater than 1. So from our list, we know that we need to divide it by 2. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. So, since 1 is the only factor that 3 and 5, we've gotten it down to 3/5 here. Think through factors of 3, that would only be 1 and 3. Factors of 5 would only be 1 and 5. So 1 is their greatest common factor, so that tells us this 3/5 is in simplest form. We cannot simplify that fraction down to a smaller form. So, since 1 is the only factor that 3 and 5 have in common, 3/5 is written in simplest form. Okay? Let's use that idea and try some here together. Number 1 up here says write 8/10 in simplest form. So I'm going to think through. I'm not going to draw a diagram. That's going to take too long. but I am going to use the idea of using common factors for it. So my two numbers are 8 and 10 that I'm thinking about. Well, one thing I noticed, 8 and 10 are both even numbers, aren't they? So 2 has to be a common factor. Let's see, factors of 8 would be 1, 2, 4, and 8. Factors of 10 would be 1, 2, 5, and 10. So it sounds to me like 2 is going to be the greatest common factor between 8 and 10. So I'm going to divide both the 8 and the 10 by 2. We do the same thing to the numerator and the denominator in order to simplify it. 8 divided by 2 equals 4. 10 divided by 2 equals 5. 8/10 written in simplest form would be 4/5. Let's try that same idea on some here together. We have 6/12. Now, just to help me remind myself what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take 6, I'm going to take 12, and I'm going to write out their factors. So let's see. The factors of 6. 1 is a factor. It's even, so 2 is a factor. And 2 times 3 is 6. And 6 is a factor of it. For 12, 1 is a factor. It's even, so 2 is. Would 3 be a factor of 12? Can I multiply a number by 3 and get 12? Yes. 3 times what? 4. 3 times 4 is 12. So now I need the factor pair here for 2. What number times 2 will give me 12? 6. And then what number times 1 would give me 12? Would be 12. So there's my factors of 6 and my factors of 12. Now I need to look for their greatest common factor that they have with each other. Well, they both have 1, they both have 2, they both have 3, and they both have 6. That is the greatest common factor that they have together. So what I'm going to think, I'm going to take my 6/12 and I am going to divide it by that greatest factor, 6/6, and do each step here. 6 divided by 6 is 1. 12 divided by 6 is 2. So taking the fraction 6/12 and writing it in simplest form, its simplest form would be 1/2. Okay, let's try one more here. We have 2/10. If I do that same idea of thinking through their factors, factors of 2 are 1 and 2. Factors of 10 would be 1, 2. 2 times 5 would give me 10, and 1 times 10 would give me 10. So, common factors, they both have a 1, they both have a 2. That's their greatest one right there. So now I'm going to take 2/10, divide it by 2/2, since that's its greatest common factor. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. So 2/10 written in simplest form is 1/5. Okay, so it really helps you to know your multiplication facts, which help you know your factors in order to help you be able to simplify fractions. Okay, so some of your questions you were asked, you may have been asked to take some fractions and write them in simplest form. Or sometimes you would have questions where it asks you to tell whether the fraction is in simplest form or not. And you write yes if it is or no if it is not. So remember, the way that you can check to see if it's in simplest form yet, if the only factor that the numerator and the denominator have in common is 1, then it's already in simplest form and you cannot simplify it anymore. If there's a common factor greater than 1 between the two numbers, then it can be simplified down to a simpler fraction.